Hello, everyone. I will be your guest lecturer for this week. My name is Andrew Kramer, and I am currently an assistant professor over at the University of Akron in the Department of Anthropology. And Dr. Spurlock kind of emailed me and asked if I'd be willing to kind of lend my expertise in talking to you guys about archaeological ethics, as well as something called NAGPRA, which stands for the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, right? So in this kind of lecture, we'll go over what is NAGPRA, as well as what is archaeological ethics, and what exactly do we do when we find human remains out at various archaeological sites, and what are the ethical implications of finding those human remains, and why we need laws in order to prevent people from essentially grave robbing Native Americans and selling their funerary objects and their remains, right? So to give you a little bit of background on myself, I'm actually a recent graduate of Kent State University with my Master's of Arts in Anthropology, and then I went on to take a teaching position at the University of Akron. I also do part-time teaching in anthropology at Kent State University as well as Cuyahoga Community College. So other than that, my specific research interests and specialties are I do prehistoric dietary reconstructions using fossilized tooth plaque. So I am actually someone who is very, very familiar with NAGPRA, right? Because a lot of the materials that I use for research are actually kind of covered under NAGPRA. So I have to be very careful in terms of how I do my research and what I'm publishing in terms of, what identifying characteristics and things like that. So without further ado, just kind of work your way through the lecture. Each slide has a brief recording to it, or you can just read your way through it. There will be a video about halfway through the lecture. At that point, you need to kind of switch over to the PowerPoint version of this lecture and kind of click the link to view the video. So without further ado, let's get started talking about archaeological ethics and NAGPRA.
But before we get into all of the details surrounding NAGPRA and how the law works here, we'll take kind of a brief second here and kind of talk about, or at least consider to ourselves, what is death and human emotion, right? What do these kind of images evoke for you in terms of feelings and emotions about death, right? You can see in the top left here, we have just a kind of a regular casket burial. In the top right, we have what they call cliffside burials, where the coffin is actually placed into the side of a cliff. Of course, we have ceremonies in some countries where the dead are taken out of their crypts and paraded around the streets once a year in a celebration. We also have things like sky burials, which occur in Nepal and Tibet, where they leave the deceased individual out in a field and allow the animals to scavenge off of them. So no matter what culture you're looking at, no matter what human group you're looking at, we all have some sort of ceremony, some sort of opinion, some sort of emotions that go along with death, right? So responses to death are what we in anthropology call a cultural universal, right? It's something that occurs in every single culture. And we have cared for a very long time about death, right? Some of our earliest burials go back to the Neanderthals at or around 60,000 years ago. And these first burials were discovered by Ralph Selecki in 1950, right? This is what we call in the image you see featured to the right here, a flexed burial position, right? Where the knees are taken and they are pulled up to the chest as the individual is laid down, right? And we know that this was a purposeful burial based on the analysis of the pollen in the soil surrounding the burial, right? We find a whole lot of wildflowers and things like that that would never grow inside of a cave where this burial was found, right? So we know that they were bringing in these organics and these flowers and things like that to lay with the body. So what we're really getting at the heart of here is, how do we treat the dead of other cultures and other people, right? In archaeology, we're always digging in the dirt, and sometimes we do come across burials, right? Humans bury their dead all the time. So when you come across one of these burials, how do you deal with the remains of someone else's ancestors, right? Because I really don't think it really matters what culture you really come from, right? So does it really matter who they were or when they died, right? It's just as important to treat those remains with respect. In the United States today, many Native American people and American Indians ask why their dead don't receive the same treatment or don't receive equal treatment from members of the academic community and scientists. So if we are so concerned with the treatment of our own dead by creating cemeteries, by creating very specific laws around, how you treat human remains, it's actually in most places illegal to have human remains that are not properly disposed of. So if we in, the United States have such a big care about how we treat our dead, why don't we extend that privilege, or why don't we extend that same kind of courtesy, that same kind of notion of care to other individuals and other cultures living within our country? So you might be asking yourself, why are archaeologists concerned with human remains or the remains of people in general? Well, there's a lot of stuff that we can ascertain about a culture as well as a group of people biologically by studying their remains, right? So what can we tell about a past people by looking at their dead? We can look at things like phenotypic attributes, right? We can look at what type of physical attributes might be specific to that culture or group. We look at demography, right? What constitutes that culture and that group and any unique characteristics. We can look at nutritional patterns, right? We can actually take fossilized plaque off of your teeth, dissolve it in acid, and tell you what you were eating shortly before you died. Or we can look at their bones and look at other nutritional patterns, right? That they deal with vitamin deficiencies throughout their lifetime. We can also look for diseases and trauma, right? Broken bones are noticeable, as well as any type of diseases like tuberculosis or treponemal diseases, which may have gone through that population at that time. We can also get an idea of burial practices as well. How did these people bury their dead, and what was the significance behind it? And we can also look at social status. We can get a good idea of how valuable or how how much prestige an individual had within their culture just by looking at the burial goods. We also hear a lot in popular media when talking about kind of repatriation and dealing with past human remains, particularly Native American remains, is this whole argument for retention. It's the kind of notion that we need to keep these remains around in case we invent something like new techniques in order to assess them, right? This is also known as kind of the quote-unquote new techniques argument, right? And this is really based off of the drive or the urge to search for the causes of modern diseases in ancient populations, right? So many scientists will continue to argue for keeping human remains for further study. But with today's technology, with 3D scanning, with images, as well as the ability to take very precise measurements, this argument is or the point behind this argument is kind of mute, right? You can kind of gather all of the data that you need from those remains through verbal or through visual and calculating assessment, things like that, without having to actually have the physical remains or keep them for long periods of time, right? So kind of the new technique that people use, if they have permission from the Native American group, is that they will study the remains, take the measurements of them and images, and then repatriate them as quickly as possible. The repatriation movement, or kind of the development, or what really led up to the passal or the proposing and passing of a national legislation like NAGPRA in the United States, came from an individual named Maria Pearson in the 1970s in Iowa, specifically Glenwood, Iowa, where she noticed while they were doing a public works project that the archaeologists came across 27 human remains, right? 25 of them were white and 2 of them were Native American. And what Pearson noticed is that the individuals, now mind you, all of them were relatively of the same age, or in terms of same time period, about mid 1700s. She noticed that the 25 white individuals were exhumed and moved to a local cemetery and reburied, whereas the 2 Native American individuals were taken, exhumed, and brought to museums for study, right? So she kind of wanted to point out, well, this is a bit, hypocritical and ridiculous that we will give the respective reburial to all of the white individuals, but, the Native Americans, who are considered, quote unquote, the other, are kind of shuffled off to a museum for further study when they, too, should be given the same respectful burial rights. About 10 years after Maria Pearson first kind of brought up the hypocrisy in terms of how Native American remains were treated by archaeologists out in the Midwest there. We have the Dixon Mountain protest, which occurred in Illinois near a place called Lewistown. And what really caused this protest was, during this time, people were really starting to kind of buy into this idea that we really don't have the right to take Native American people's possessions as well as their kind of ancestors and display them in museums like their curiosities, right? And the Dixon Mounds was actually particularly bad at this. They had a whole lot of burials there, and they had them all on full display, laying with all of their associated burial items and things like that. And so really what they're saying is that, in terms of if you were Native American, that it was perfectly okay for us to kind of go into your sacred cemeteries, dig up your ancestors, and put them on display like they were in some sort of macabre zoo. So a lot of activists kind of in the mid to late 80s started building off of this prior legislation known as the 1978 American Indian Religious Freedom Act. And this had some impact. As a matter of fact, it spurred the creation of something called the Peacekeeper Conference in 1985, which was conducted as part of the Peacekeeper Missile Silo Project, which happened in Vermilion, South Dakota, right? And you can see down in the bottom or the kind of top left corner here, you can see Chief Frank Foolscrow blesses the ceremony with the crazy horse pipe. So the Peacekeeper Conference, in essence, what it really did was kind of, they knew they had to build this missile silo in an area that was sacred to these Native Americans, right? And so in essence, what they did was they contacted the Native Americans group, they kept an open dialogue with them, and they ended up working with the group to kind of get a construction project as well as a way to deal with any potential remains that was kind of in compliance with everyone's feelings. So after this, we had the archaeologists began to start having discussions on how do we address the treatment of the dead, right? In the World Archaeological Congress, the first inter-congress on archaeological ethics and the treatment of the dead had 20 countries represented. There were also 27 Indian nations there as well, and it compiled something referred to as the Vermilion Accord. So the Vermilion Accord was adopted in 1989 at the South Dakota World Archaeological International Congress there. And not to go over a single point here, we'll just read a couple. In essence, it's respect for the mortal remains of the dead shall be accorded to all, irrespective of origin, race, religion, nationality, custom, and tradition. The respect for the wishes of the dead concerning disposition shall be accorded whenever possible. Respect reasonable and lawful when they are known or can be reasonably inferred. Respect for the wishes of the local community or of the relatives or guardians of the dead shall be accorded whenever possible, reasonable, and lawful. Respect for the scientific research value of skeletal, mummified, and other human remains, including fossil hominids, shall be accorded when such value is demonstrated to exist, right? So it's not just a matter of just saying, well, we could potentially find out something from these human remains in the future. No, you have to be able to demonstrate that those remains have a legitimate academic and scientific purpose during that time.
This later led to the Museum, or the National Museum of the American Indian Act of 1989, which was the first national repatriation law, which focused on federal museums and, in essence, basically told all the federal museums you need to repatriate any Native American burial as well as burial goods. So the Smithsonian itself, one of our most prestigious, repatriated over 2,000 human skeletons, many of which were collected by Franz Boas and John Wesley Powell. For those of you that are anthropologists, you kind of know them as kind of being the fathers of American anthropology and American archaeology, but they too participated in this practice of essentially grave robbing. And this brings up perhaps our most famous case in North America of kind of NAGPRA repatriation. We have the Kenwick Manor, otherwise known as the Ancient One. The Kenwick Man is a 9,000-year-old skeleton found in the banks of the Columbia River in Washington in 1996. And as of February 2017, Kenwick's Man remains were returned to indigenous people and buried in an unknown location. This is showing you kind of a picture of Kenwick Man when he was first found. And what started this whole kind of conflict was that Kenwick Man had some unique phenotypic traits with his skull that didn't kind of match a lot of the other Native American skulls that we have from that area at that time. So they thought that he may have been kind of a, quote, lost Russian trapper, and that's why he wasn't kind of afforded protection under our normal kind of repatriation laws and things like that. So the Kenwick Man did provide some kind of social benefit here. The debate around this was the debate around indigenous rights over the remains of their ancestors, and the Kenwick Man debate spurred the passing of this federal legislation known as Nagpra, right? And we already talked about this, but just to cover it again, it means the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act. So in essence, when archaeologists excavating on public land, when they find Native American remains, they are required to stop, document, and begin to kind of work on a way to repatriate those remains back to the descendants of the Native American group in which the site they are digging. So some of those features that they saw in the Kenwick Man that kind of made them think that he was not Native American. He had no shovel-shaped incisors, which is actually kind of a hallmark for most Native American groups. They have a very interesting shape to the to their front teeth. So at this point, legally and kind of before the passing of Nagpra, whoever finds ancient remains holds possession over those remains, right? So until all the way up until 1996, our country had a basic rule that if you found human remains on your property and they weren't the subject of a murder or something like that, then they were yours to keep in essence, or anything that was associated with those remains were yours to keep. But in essence, if we look at the kind of court cases that have come out of this whole debate, we know that the U.S. Supreme Court has already ruled that the University of Washington Museum has no right to keep the remains of the Kenwick Man. So they were ordered to be given back to contemporaneous Native American groups for reburial, a group called the Umatilla, right? So in essence, no one owns the past, right? You don't get exclusivity to the past. We all have to kind of try to work together to deal with these kind of archaeological remains in the most respectful manner, so that we're not alienating groups that still exist today. So to give you the definition of NAGPRA from the NAGPRA website, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act was enacted on November 16, 1990 to address the rights of lineal descendants, Indian tribes, and Native Hawaiian organizations to Native American cultural items, including human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony. NAGPRA itself applies in three different contexts. It applies when the repatriation of human remains and the cultural items from museums and federal agencies. It also applies to the protection of burial sites and cultural items located on federal and tribal land, and as well as the trafficking in Native American human remains as well as cultural items. Who has to follow NAGPRA? Well, any public institution must follow NAGPRA. Any museum must follow NAGPRA. Anyone with public funding must follow NAGPRA. And this is even true if your public funding is being used to commit archaeological excavations on private property, right? At that point, the project becomes a publicly funded project that is kind of umbrellaed under NAGPRA, right? And basically anyone doing archaeology really should follow the kind of spirit and tenet of NAGPRA, right? Because really what this is doing is this is one of the few ways that our government has created in which we can create a respectful dialogue with Native American groups, right? And kind of start to begin to heal those large and gaping wounds that our government has kind of caused to those people and their descendants over time. So there are different meanings behind NAGPRA, right? There's the cultural meaning. These are items which are significant to Native Americans, and their thoughts, feelings, desires, and wishes should be respected. You have the social aspect, which is the burial rites are a social tradition in Native American culture, right? So relationships are formed between museums and Native American communities that usually do not occur, at least in a respectful manner. There's also an economic meaning, right, that repatriations and documentation may not occur at some museums without federal funds, right, because it is an expensive effort to go through this, right? Essentially, you have to pay someone to go through all these remains, figure out what's there, identify everything, catalog everything, and then begin to work on the repatriation process, right, all of which costs money. There are 5 major provisions of NAGPRA, right? It's the first is to resolve the right and to return, right? These are the guidelines to return human remains and cultural items. There's also a review committee, which monitors the NAGPRA program, helps organizations with related questions to the process. There's a grant as a provision, which is federal monies to organizations to help with documentation and repatriation of human remains. There are also civil penalties, right? They can enforce civil penalties for noncompliance in the form of fines and things like that. And it's to establish the crime of trafficking in human antiquities. So what items are covered under NAGPRA legislation? Well, we have Native American human remains, of course, right? It's actually in the title. But we also have funerary objects, and there are a couple different categories of those. You have associated funerary objects, which are objects that are found in direct association with the individual with the burial. We have unassociated funerary objects, in which these are objects that we know are used for funeral purposes or burial rites, yet were not found in direct association with the body. And there are also sacred objects. Any object that we could be considered integral to their worldview as well as their religion, these things would also be covered under NAGPRA. So to give you a few more details, what is a funerary object, right? Funerary objects are any objects that may be part of a burial ceremony which is reasonably believed to have been placed with or near an individual human remains at the time of death or later. And funerary objects, you know, in some cases, they don't necessarily need to be these large golden sarcophagi masks that we find in Egypt, or these large jade pendants and things like that we find in Mesoamerica and in Southeast Asia. In a lot of instances, some of these funerary objects are quite simple items like arrowheads and stone tools, right? So just because the object may not be spectacular or made out of a precious metal or something like that, does not mean it does not carry significant cultural value and meaning within that culture, right? That's why it's very important to kind of take a very full grasp of what we're looking at in terms of funerary objects. So we talked about this a little bit briefly about the 2 types of funerary objects. So we have associated funerary objects, which were made exclusively for burial purposes or to contain human remains and are linked with an identified set of human remains in possession or control of a federal or a museum or federal agency, or rejoined with an identified set of human remains. We have unassociated funerary objects, which are objects in the possession or control of a museum or federal agencies that are separated from the human remains that were buried with and cannot be connected to a specific individual, right? So in essence, we know that they're used for burial practices, they just were not specifically used for a specific individual. So your funerary objects can be everything from this little hair pick that is buried directly with an individual, as well as a large sarcophagi, right? This specific sarcophagi was empty, right? It was one that was being prepared to be used, but was never actually used, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to contain a body. It just has to, you know, have a known association with a funerary or burial practices. And of course, sacred objects count too, right? Like our little prayer rattle here from Nepal. And these are considered objects of cultural patrimony, right? These are objects that have historical, traditional, or cultural importance to the group. And these may be objects used in specific religious rituals, such as burials. And it's not always easy to really determine when or what object is in essence kind of an object of cultural patrimony. An example that we like to use is the Sunni War Gods, which are actually a kind of series of statues that were made by the Zuni Native American people in the American Southwest that were placed at the borders of their country, right? And the whole notion was that those Sunni War Gods were supposed to kind of protect the kind of perimeter of the country or the perimeter of their lands or their tribal lands from invasion from evil spirits and forces which would do them harm. So when when archaeologists came across these objects, they basically looked like they were just kind of these abandoned things that were standing up in the middle of nowhere. So they took them and sold them to museums, right? So in essence, it's been kind of over 100-year-long struggle with the Sunni to try and get these objects back. And these objects hold very extreme, significant cultural importance, right? Without the Sunni War Gods protecting their culture, they believe that that is why in modern times they feel that their culture is kind of disintegrated a little bit. So how do we pay for the process of NAGPRA? Well, NAGPRA grants come in two different types, right? We have consultation grants as well as repatriation grants, and you also have private grants and private money that's used because, it's actually a good tax write-off to donate money to an archaeological excavation. So consultation grants are used to determine the cultural affiliation of items, as well as to transfer custody, to transfer control, as well as treatment if any items need to be preserved or put into a state in which damage is prevented. And then finally, the setup of repatriation or disposition. Repatriation grants, on the other hand, are used to specifically to pay for the expenses associated with transferring control of the human remains or control of the funerary objects to the Native American organization. So if we look at how NAGPRA behaves in the two kind of contexts in which archaeologists dig, right, in terms of intentional excavations where they have a site plan, they go out, they know something's there, they have a whole organized way in which they're going to dig the site. If the intentional excavation is on tribal land, tribal consent, of course, is required. And regardless of what you're doing, any party must obtain a permit in order to dig. If it's done on federal land, a notice must be given and a consultation with whatever tribe kind of holds control over that particular piece of federal land. Like, all of these things need to be done in order for intentional excavations to kind of go off without any problems. If we have an inadvertent discovery of human remains, you're out on an archaeological site, you don't really know what's there, and you end up coming across human remains. A person who discovered the items must cease activity for 30 days and make a reasonable effort to protect the items. They must then notify the federal agency if on federal land, or the tribe/Native Hawaiian organization if on tribal land, right? When the federal agency receives notice, it must notify the appropriate tribe or Native Hawaiian organization, right? So when it's kind of an inadvertent discovery, it kind of throws a lot of wrenches into things. I hope you guys so far in the semester may have learned that, in terms of archaeology, a lot of archaeology that's done is not for the sake of discovering history, but more for the sake of making sure nothing is there so that they can build a freeway or a building or a highway or any type of other major public work. So in essence, if you kind of have this inadvertent discovery, it does kind of delay construction projects by quite a bit, right? So it's important that we have these laws so that, those companies that are desperate to complete their projects don't just bulldoze over someone else's, ancestors' remains in order to kind of keep their schedule. If we look at the burden of proof that is laid down in terms of how NAGPRA operates, there's at present a prima facie evidence that the museum or agency did not have right of possession, i.e. they did not obtain the items with the consent of an individual or group that had the right to transfer the title, right? So it's really up to the institution to prove that they legally own those items that they are having on display, right? If a prima facie case is made, then the burden shifts to museum or agency to prove it has the right of the possession, to continue to hold the possession. If we look at some of the other cases, right, we talked a little bit about Kenwick Man, which is actually called Bonishon versus the United States. And this interpreted the statute to apply only to human remains and cultural items that bear a significant relationship to a presently existing tribe, people, our culture, right? And this is not adopted by any other circuit today, right? So in essence, really what they tried to do here was kind of really myopically define what is considered a funerary object, whereas it doesn't really apply when you go with the national law and kind of look at it. That's why no other courts have really adopted this stance on Native American funerary items. So if we look at the consultation procedures on federal lands, a notice must be sent to the known lineal descendants, tribes, or Native Hawaiian organizations, the tribes that essentially aboriginally occupied the land. So that tribe you're contacting may not still live in that area. They may live in another part of the country, but they, in terms of before Europeans got here, that's where their tribe existed. Agencies should also seek to identify traditional religious leaders as well. So this is showing you some of the tribal nations that we have that were aboriginal to Ohio, right? We have people like the Kalakahoas and the Ofo, right, as the Kikapoe and the Pekoi, right? So we have actually a whole host, and this is just the ones that were kind of more around towards these, when Europeans first got here. If we start to kind of further go back into history, we see there's actually a whole lot of different Native American groups that used to live in Ohio. One thing that actually happens quite often when museums go to do their repatriation process is that they have these funerary objects, they have these human remains, but they don't have a location in which they came from, right? So what do you do if you know the cultural affiliation of the object, you know what culture it came from, but you don't know the location in which the object was originally found? Well, we have in 1978, they have judicially established Indian lands or Native American lands in which they hold kind of judiciary over, and for this purposes, this is in terms of NAGPRA, we use this kind of system in order to figure out, well, since the object is, Sioux, or Crow or Blackfeet, we know that we can go to that area, ask those tribes, and they may be able, may be able to take the item back for us, right, without having to know the actual specific location of where the item was originally found. So if we look at some possible outcomes, commentary to the regulation states that in C2, preservation of sites should be considered whenever possible once you have completed kind of the repatriation process. But NAGPRA itself does not prevent excavation, right? A lot of people think that, well, if there's remains there, we have to stop and nobody gets to dig anymore. And that's not exactly true, right? If excavation ownership and control of the items can pass to descendants or tribe, and if the legal criteria are met, if not, it becomes the property of the United States government, right? So in essence, right, if you find human remains or Native American remains, you have to go through, according to NAGPRA, every conceivable effort to try and repatriate those remains. If you are unable to do so, the remains don't just become, frivolent, they end up becoming the property of the United States government. And the reason they have this whole provision for kind of property transfer in terms of it becoming the property of the U.S. government after a certain period of time of no repatriation, this really relates back to something called trafficking, right? And it was kind of meant to kind of prohibit trafficking in human remains without consent of the next of kin, tribe, or Native Hawaiian organization. It prohibits trafficking in cultural items if obtained in violation of the act, right? So selling human remains, whether ancient or recent, is illegal in all 50 states in the United States, right? Only in very specific contexts and very specific instances can you buy human remains. So to quickly give you a little bit of details on the review committee, it's a 7-member committee. It's 3 Native American, at least 2 traditional Native American religious leaders, 3 from a museum and scientific community, and 1 chosen by a list compiled by the other 6, right? So, and what they do is they make recommendations to the Secretary of the Interior on regulations and monitors inventory process, makes recommendations to parties in disputed cases, as well as submits reports to Congress. So to give you a brief kind of overview of the entire process of NAGPRA, in essence, the institutions will catalog each item they have. The cultural items are then photographed. The remains are cataloged, but in most instances not photographed unless you have a specific biological data that you need to get from that remains. Most of the time they are not photographed because in a lot of Native American groups, they believe that photographing the remains affects the spirit of the individual once they've passed. So they tend to not photograph Native American human remains during this NAGPRA process. Then they move on to the kind of paperwork phase, which each item must be meticulously documented, right? They have to write a little description on every item. They must count every single piece and fragment of the item. If you're dealing with lots and lots of things, sometimes you only provide weight, like you have 25 pounds of broken pottery or 25 pounds of arrowheads, things like that. An inventory is then compiled, and copies of the inventory are given to the U.S. government as well as possible native groups that you may be repatriating the remains to. And to get close to wrapping things up here, just to cover the last part of the process, which is repatriation. So recent regulations govern repatriation of human remains whose cultural affiliation cannot be determined, right? The museum or federal agency must offer to return culturally unaffiliated items or remains if removed from tribal land or tribal aboriginal territory. So this means that even if they can't prove direct association with the culture, if it was found in the same area the culture lived historically, then they need to repatriate them. So culturally affiliated tribes that are not federally recognized may repatriate if no federally recognized tribe who could make a claim objects. And this is kind of a very interesting little point here. Really, the repatriation process only covers federally recognized tribes. They do have an avenue, as you can see here, which allows unkind of recognized tribes to file a claim, but that's only in the instance in which a recognized tribe doesn't already claim the items, right? So you can kind of see how there might even be a little bit of cultural theft from one another going on here with how this system is kind of set up here. So you may have individuals from groups that may no longer be federally recognized that have cultural items, but they may not be able to get them back because of a claim that's being made by a larger, more federally recognized tribe. So I will provide Dr. Spurlock with a PowerPoint version of this lecture as well as a video copy so that you can kind of go and follow some of these links and watch some of the videos, or there's one video that I would like you guys to watch about midway through the lecture, and I'll put a link in there for it. So just kind of make sure you review this stuff and, be aware that we do in the United States have a national provision for what happens when we find Native American goods and burials in different archaeological contexts, right? And always remember that, it's not necessarily just a matter of preserving history. It's not necessarily just a matter of increasing our academic knowledge about a group of people. There's also an element of cultural respect and an element of cultural theft that goes into things like this that we need to consider, right? The way I like to put it for most people is that, you would be very upset if you came home and had a call from the police to let you know that someone went through and, robbed the grave of your great-grandmother, right? And took all of the stuff off her body and took her bones and hightailed it off to a museum somewhere. So, kind of try to extend that same consideration to Native American people, right? They're just as upset when they find out that somebody's been going around their cemeteries digging up their ancestors. And with that, we'll kind of conclude our talk on the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act. And I thank all of you for allowing me the opportunity to give you this brief lecture. So have a good day, and I hope I will catch you all soon.